This slideshow will be a review and summary of Chapter 1, Lesson 4 about the population and economy of the American colonies. Between the years 1650 and 1700, the population in America exploded. It went from 50,000 European people up to 250,000 European people. And during this time, the colonies really rapidly developed. And they kind of developed in these three different regions that we're going to talk a lot about in this slideshow. We're going to talk about the differences between them. Developed into the New England colonies, which are depicted in green up here, into the middle colonies, which are depicted in purple, and into the southern colonies depicted in red. So when we think about the South, sometimes we think way down here, but the southern colonies are right here, and then the middle colonies are actually pretty far north. The New England colonies were mostly just kind of about small towns. All right. The people that lived there, in order to get their food, they lived mostly off of subsistence farming. Subsistence farming is an interesting term. It just means that you're growing enough to feed yourself and support your family. So you're growing just enough to survive. You're not growing a whole bunch of a crop to sell off to somebody else. You're not making money off of it. You're just eating off of your own garden or farm or whatever. And so, it kept these people into these small towns. But at the very beginning of colonial New England, these people had these things called town meetings. And basically, a town meeting was everybody who wanted to could come to this town meeting from the town, and they could discuss local problems, local issues. And at first, they were more like managing the affairs, like trading and getting resources, stuff like that for the town. But eventually, it developed into talking about problems, electing people, deciding that anyone who was a male landowner could vote and pick people to be their government, basically. So it slowly developed into a government. And in this area of New England, this is really where they were kind of allowed to govern themselves and take their power, or take the power themselves instead of listening to what England wanted all the time. And so this kind of turned into this strong belief in the right to govern themselves. They should always be allowed to govern themselves. But also, most of the people that lived there were Puritans. So they had very interesting values. Their values were, this really strong religious devotion. Okay, so they just like religion was super important. They also valued hard work, and they valued education. Back even in 1642, it was required for the parents and the ministers to teach all the children to read so they could understand the Bible. So again, this education leading into religion. And only 5 years later, any town with over 50 families had to get an elementary school. And then any of them with over 100 families started to set up these secondary schools. So very early in the history of New England, schools were being set up for kids. In the middle colonies, the type of people that came here to these areas like New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, they were coming a lot for the religious freedom and the toleration of other people. So a lot of these people were not even from England. They were from, some of them were Scots-Irish, some of them were German. These non-English immigrants started to come in and fill up these societies, and they brought kind of interesting skills that the English people did not have. And because of these interesting skills, and because of their location on these beautiful ports, these big cities started to develop. Places like Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, they grew into these really big cities. And within these big cities, these social classes started to develop. Okay, and so the top social class that had the most power and influence were the wealthy merchants. The wealthy merchants were a very small group of people. Okay, but they were the people who controlled all of the trade in the city. So, they dressed fancy like the British upper class. They wore these fancy clothes and rode carriages and all that kind of stuff through the streets. You could tell who these wealthy merchants were just by how they looked and how they acted. But they controlled all of the trade. And then the second group was about 50%. About half of the people were in this middle class were skilled artisans. So these are people that had a skill, could make shoes, were a blacksmith, was something like that. They had some sort of skill that they could market. and about half of those people performed the skill, owned a business, and they were kind of the second class right below the wealthy merchants. And then people without skills or property was about 30% of the people. And what they did is they usually either worked as servants for the richer people, or they worked in the harbor loading and unloading ships. And then somewhere in that 10 to 20% range of people were slaves and indentured servants. Those were definitely the lowest class until the indentured servants earned their freedom or the slaves bought their freedom. They were seen more as property than as people. In the South, they developed this kind of hierarchy, social hierarchy of different classes. And again, at the top were the very rich people, as usual. Okay, the plantation owners. They own these huge farms with many cash crops like cotton and tobacco and indigo and all of these different things. Okay, and really, while everybody wanted to be a plantation owner and be one of these rich ones, very few were actually successful in doing that. Okay, most of the people were in these next two middle classes. The backcountry farmer, these people at least had their own land, but it was usually very small farms, and they were only able to farm a subsistence level of crops. So they were only able to farm enough to feed themselves, and they were further away from the ocean, which made it harder for them to trade their goods anyway. The third one was tenant farmers. Tenant farmers are people that did not have their own land, but instead went and worked on someone else's farm and someone else's land and got paid for it. So basically, just a worker on one of these plantations or another farm. The fourth class would be the indentured servant. So indentured servant is basically, it's not a slave, but it's kind of like a slave. The farmer would buy you and buy your work for a certain number of years. And while you were working for them, they would make sure you had food, shelter, clothing, all that kind of stuff. Okay. And then once their servitude was done, once their however many years of work you charged them was done, then they could move out on their own and be free. And so usually they were brought over to America and they said, well, I'll work for 5 years or whatever if you can pay for my boat ride to America and keep me in food, shelter, and clothes. Okay. And it was really kind of profitable, especially for these big plantation owners, to do this because it didn't cost that much to keep them in clothes and everything. And every single person, every indentured servant that came onto that farm, the landowner would get another 50 acres of land given to them if they brought them over. So really what they had to pay for was a boat ride, and that got them 50 more acres of land. And then, of course, the lowest class was the slaves. Take a moment to write out your answer to this question. So we're gonna touch more on slavery, but we need to kind of understand how it started to grow. And this happened in one of the things that caused this was Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion is about Nathaniel Bacon. And what was happening is the backwood farmers, the people that just had a small farm, were being attacked by Native Americans. And they needed help to defend themselves against these Native Americans. And so they asked the Virginia governor, the English guy, to help them out, come out and attack these Native Americans, do something about it. And they said no. And so Nathaniel Bacon put together a militia just like a fighting force. And he created that so that he could defend those people against the natives. But then they were frustrated and mad at this governor. And so they marched to Jamestown and burned it to the ground. Now, this rebellion ended soon after because Nathaniel Bacon became ill and died, and so their leader was gone, but it did have these really strong, lasting consequences, okay? The consequences were, number one, that the backcountry farmers just needed more land, okay? So it convinced the wealthy planters that more land should be made available for the backcountry farmers, and so now all of a sudden these backcountry farmers have more land, and that increases slavery. Okay, and again, These slaves never had to be freed, never had to be given land, so they were a much better investment than an indentured servant, okay? And so people started to desire them. They needed people to work their bigger farms. And so the king, King Charles II, gave the Royal African Company a charter to start trading slaves. He made it legal, he made it okay, okay? And so they started to bring slaves over, tons and tons of slaves over. It made it much easier for the people to get those slaves. And not only that, but there was another advantage to slavery. Okay, slaves, because they were property, they could be used as collateral to borrow money and expand their plantation. You say, I'm going to borrow this money from you, bank. If I don't pay you back, you can take my slaves as part of my property to pay back the debt. So, with the economy of the colonies, what was really, really important and we need to understand is the triangular trade. Okay. In the colonies, they didn't have factories to make things that they needed on a day to day basis, like clothing or guns or tools. Okay. And so they needed those things from England. But the problem is, England didn't need the things that America had. Okay. And so a lot of the things that America was getting, at least the New England colonies, were not needed over in England. They could get them themselves. So they had to figure out a way to trade and make some money, or in this case notes, to be able to buy those goods from England. So what ended up happening is they started to trade those things that they had, the fish, the flour, the livestock, the lumber, all the things that were needed, to these sugar plantations down in the Caribbean. All right, and with that, they got back these bills of sale. So think of it almost like money that they could spend on the goods from England. Okay, and then they could trade that money, those bills of sale, over to England, and the manufactured goods and luxuries that they wanted would come back. The other thing they got was molasses from the Caribbean, and they were able to turn that into rum, and then they could sell that rum, the alcohol, over to England or down over to Africa as well. And then the third part was Africa. And in Africa, what was happening is they were going and they were gathering slaves as well as other things. Okay, but they were gathering slaves and they were bringing those over to the Caribbean. Okay, and in exchange for that, England would bring down the goods that were needed to these companies, like guns, cloth, iron, beer, what they needed to keep that company going and continue to make money. So it was this intricate triangle of trade, because the two main trade partners, England and North America, they didn't need what each other had, or not everybody had what everybody needed, and so it turned into this thing. But this made a whole lot of money for the people in New England, especially. And those people started to be able to make their own factories so they could do a better job of refining sugar, do a better job of creating their own finished products, and decrease their reliance on England a little bit. All right, now we're just going to take a quick look at the colonies' economies. In New England, some of the biggest things, as we know, was not farming really. They were just small subsistence farms, so they weren't making a whole lot of money off of that. But they would make good money off of was fishing and whaling. Fishing right by the Grand Banks, this big shallow area still has tons and tons of fish in it. Just tons of cod, mackerel, halibut, herring, all of these fish that people would love to eat. And then going out and killing the whales, the whale blubber was used to make candles, lamp oil. The bones were used for buttons and combs and all kinds of other items. So whales were a very important resource as well. And then the area was very heavily wooded, and so the lumber industry and sawmills did quite a bit of business there too. And then, of course, with that wood, they would often make ships and build ships, which made a lot of money for New England. So that's kind of the New England economy. And then if we look at the middle colonies, it's kind of all about the farming. All right, so we're looking in here at the middle colonies, And we're seeing that they had good soil. They had a longer growing season than New England. And so what they were able to do was start to make cash crops, and their most important cash crop was wheat. And so they were able to make wheat and process it into flour and sell it off and make a whole lot of money off of it. And the cool thing about it is in the early and mid 1700s, demand around the world for wheat soared. It got really, really big because a population boom happened in Europe. And so it almost doubled in price, making people very, very rich in this area and growing those cities even bigger. And when they wanted to send it across to Europe, there were these three huge, wide rivers that allowed them to, the Hudson, the Delaware, and the Susquehanna, and they were deep in there, and so it made it really easy for the farmers to ship their crops across to Europe. In the southern colonies, it was all about the plantations, these big cash crop plantations. Okay, and their first crop that they made in Virginia and those areas, okay, that was tobacco, and tobacco made them a whole lot of money. And then they tried a couple of different things that did not work out super well a little bit further south, but they tried rice and they kind of failed at rice. All right, but what was happening at this time is a lot of the indentured servants that were brought over, they were dying before they even earned their freedom. And a lot of people were saying, I don't think I'm going to do that or I'm not going to be an indentured servant because you don't make it. It's not really worth it. Okay. And so slavery started to come up. And when they were failing at rice, all of these people from West Africa were being brought over as slaves. And those people had cultivated rice before. They had made rice. And so they started to show the Europeans how to do the rice properly, and it took off, and it was a big cash crop. And then on a lot of even further south areas started to grow indigo. Indigo, it would create a dye for cloth, and it would make cloth blue. Okay, and it was very sought after. So that was a big cash crop as well in the southern colonies. All right, write out your 3 questions you have from the notes so far. If you don't have any, remember to create some test questions. I should see this part of your notes filled.